Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to the first video that I'm putting together for social theory. So I just started with this, so there's some actually rough edges around this particular piece of software that I'm using. One issue that I've been having is that there's been this flashing that I actually can't see while I'm recording, but comes up sometimes during the actual videos themselves. It's been happening mostly around this title screen where the whole screen is blue. I'm hoping that it doesn't happen anywhere else. Maybe it doesn't even happen there. But if you do see some blue flashing, I apologize for that. I'm working on trying to get rid of it, but at this point I don't know how to do that. But it hopefully will get better as we move forward. So I want to start off just by doing a little bit of review, because we're going to focus right now on commodities, which we covered quite a bit last class, but we didn't quite finish. So let's go back a little bit to the material that we talked about last class, review it, and then I'll wrap up the stuff on commodities. So if you remember, we discussed that commodities, hopefully you can see my cursor here, I'll just indicate things. With that, commodities are the basis of wealth in capitalism. So where we talked about feudalism, where land is the basis of wealth, in primitive communism, for instance, the basis of wealth, not that they had an idea of wealth the same way we do, but if we're going to think of wealth, the wealth that they had came from the territory that they lived on, the amount of food that they were able to draw from the land, the size of the herd that they followed, all that. Well, in capitalism, commodities are the basis of wealth. It's not money. Money is a big part of commodities and what commodities are and access to commodities, but commodities and money are different things. So there are three features to commodities. First, they are objects outside of people. We talked in class about how that definition really probably doesn't apply anymore because we can think of knowledge as commodities, we can think of software as commodities, which aren't physical things. They're more ones and zeros in computers. But if we're thinking for Marx, in Marxian terms, then we want to think in terms of objects, physical objects. The commodities satisfy a human need or desire, so there's got to be somebody out there who wants or needs the thing. If there's an item out there that nobody has any desire for, nobody has any need for it, then it really can't be a commodity. And that's really connected to this third feature, which is that commodities are bought and sold on markets. Now, if nobody wants it, no one's going to buy it. I also want to just quickly point out, as I mentioned in class, that it's kind of redundant to say bought and sold, because if something is bought, then it's also sold. If something's sold, it's also bought. You can't just be bought or just be sold. It doesn't work. It doesn't make any sense. So one goes with the other. So as we discussed in class, commodities possess two types of value. There's use value and exchange value. I'm going to go through these relatively quickly. So if you recall, we discussed how with use value, the use value is whatever the object does. So the use value of a car is that it can take us places. The use value of food is that we can eat it. The use value of chalk is that I can draw on a blackboard with it. So every item that we need or want or desire is going to have some kind of use value, even if it's just to look pretty or look nice. It doesn't need to necessarily do something amazing. But yeah, so we're surrounded by objects with use values. Now, the source of an object's use value is its physical makeup. So I gave the example in class of a tomato. So a tomato didn't come into nature to exist as food for us. Tomatoes existed in nature before. Now, human beings definitely selectively bred tomatoes, worked on different ways to make them more convenient for us, but nature is what it is. We adapt to it, not the other way around. But at some point in the past, some humans realized that if they take this thing, throw it in their mouth, they can chew it, they can swallow it, and they can ultimately digest it. And there are nutrients in that physical item, in this case the tomato, that we can use for fuel for our bodies, that our bodies can use to repair broken cells or damaged cells or build new cells and so on. So the physical makeup of the tomato allows us to eat it, allows us to chew it, swallow it, digest it, and allows our body to ultimately make use of it. The physical makeup of a piece of chalk, for instance, is such that if you take the piece of chalk and scrape it across a blackboard, it's going to leave a trail. We can use that trail to write. If that had a different chemical, physical, atomic makeup, however you want to say it, then the chalk wouldn't work as a writing utensil in a classroom. It just wouldn't work. You need to use something else. So we didn't spend a ton of time on a use value because there's less to it. So most of our time is going to be spent on exchange value. Now, exchange value, again, is one of these two values that are parts of commodities. But exchange value, unlike use value, is unique to commodities. Things that are not commodities do typically, anyway, if they're useful, have use value, but they don't have exchange value unless they're commodities. So unless an item that people want or desire enters into a market, it doesn't have exchange value. So it's not about the physical object itself, but what happens to it. So we mentioned in class that if I go buy a tomato at the grocery store, that tomato is a commodity. But if I grow a tomato and I never sell it, I just eat it, that tomato is not a commodity. Now, that's not a perfect example, because if I bought the seeds, for instance, you could definitely make an argument, and I would make the argument that that tomato would be a commodity because I purchased it. But if you think, because I purchased the seeds, but if you think back to medieval farmers or primitive communists, if they draw something from nature or they grow something, in the case of people who were farmers, and they never take that item and sell it or buy it or exchange it for anything, then it's never a commodity. So in both cases, you have a piece of food that are identical to each other, but one becomes a commodity. It kind of weirdly, symbolically transitions into a commodity. One just enters the market, but until that happens, it's not a commodity and doesn't have exchange value. So it's not about the physical object itself, it's about what happens to it, it's about what human beings do with it. So I gave you guys definitions in class. They're not great, but they are descriptive of what exchange value is. It doesn't have to make perfect sense as it's written here, and I'm not going to ever ask you to spit back this word for word, but you do need to have a sense of what it is, what it doesn't mean. So an exchange value is a quantitative relationship between commodities, and it's the proportion by which values are exchanged. So that's the actual relationship itself. So we say there's a quantitative relationship between commodities. We're saying that we're going to reduce the commodities, we're going to reduce the item to numbers. And in this case, the numbers are really going to be expressed as prices. Now, exchange value and price are not the same thing, but exchange values are expressed as prices. So with exchange value, we're thinking in terms of quantitative relationships, not qualitative. So when we think about qualitative relationships, those are qualities, those are features, characteristics of the item. So when we talk about use value, an item's use value comes from its qualities, its physical characteristics, like the fact that with a tomato you can bite it. If we couldn't bite it, it wouldn't be food. If we couldn't digest it, it wouldn't be food. So those are the qualities. And we can't really, or it's very difficult anyway, to really compare items in terms of use value. It's silly, for instance, to say which is better, a stapler or a tomato. Well, it totally depends on what you need at any given moment, right? Under certain circumstances, staplers are better. Under certain circumstances, tomatoes are better. We can describe differences. We can say tomatoes are soft and staplers are hard, but that's it. Now, with exchange value, though, you can take any two items and compare them directly. There's no awkwardness, there's no weirdness with exchange value. You can just compare them. So if we take a look at the box down at the bottom of the slide, similar again to the example I gave you guys in class, if we have an airplane that's worth $10 million, a box of chalk that's $1, and an office chair that's $100, let's say it's a decent office chair, well, then one airplane is equivalent to 10 million boxes of chalk, which is equivalent to 100,000 shares. So these are three very different items in terms of their use value, but they are can be made equivalent to each other in terms of their exchange value. So one airplane is equal to 10 million boxes of chalk. We can directly compare one airplane to 10 million boxes of chalk in terms of their exchange value. They're exactly the same thing. There's no difference. If you have an airplane hangar with one airplane in it, and you have a factory or a warehouse with 10 million boxes of chalk in it, they are identical. There's no difference between them in terms of exchange value. Same thing if we had 5 million bucks of chalk, that's worth half the airplane. If we had 20 million bucks of chalk, that's twice as much exchange value as an airplane. You can fit the 100,000 office chairs in there as well, so 100,000 office chairs are the same as 10 million bucks of chalk. 100 bucks of chalk is equivalent to an office chair, and there's no distinction. It's not like saying one's better than the other. If you have 100 bucks of chalk, one office chair, they're the same. You have 50 bucks of chalk, it's half as good as the chair. With exchange value, you can make everything equal to everything else. So, because all items can be made equivalent in terms of their exchange value, Marx, and just as a side note, this isn't purely Marx's argument. This was actually a pretty well-accepted idea at the time, so even famous economists like Adam Smith and folks like that accepted this idea as well. So this isn't really a Marxian idea, but Marx certainly works it into his theory. So Marx makes the case that all exchange value must come from the same source, and he makes the case that it's human labor. So I didn't put it in the slide, I just realized, but you should know that this argument that exchange value comes from human labor is called the labor theory of value. So it's the labor theory of value. So exchange value changes as the amount of labor needed to produce a commodity changes. So an item's exchange value is driven by human labor, so more labor goes into an item, the higher the exchange value is. So when I say that the exchange value changes, well, what does that mean? Well, there are certain things that happen that can impact, that can reduce the amount of labor that an item needs. I'm sorry, let me say that again. That reduce the amount of labor that an item needs to be produced. And I'll talk about that in a minute or two. Before I do, though, I just want to quickly show you what we mean here, or what Marx is getting at with this argument about the labor theory of value. So if we think about comparing an airplane to a box of chalk, we want to think about all of the human labor that goes into producing both of these two things. So if you just take a look at the piece of chalk on the right, basically, I Googled this a little while ago, but a basic process for producing chalk is that you have to mine limestone, or you have to get limestone. You have to transport that to a factory. You have to pulverize the limestone, apparently. There's a few steps to it. You have to add some chemicals to it, but ultimately, you do all this stuff at a factory, you can produce these little slivers of chalk that you can then process and ship. So, yeah, there's a decent amount to do with it. Every step in this process counts as human labor. So the act of going out there and finding limestone to mine. So if you have people out there whose job it is to go out there and find that, that's all part of human labor. That's work. Then you have the miners who go out and I don't know how they do it, but they break pieces off, load it onto trucks, or however it happens. I have no idea how it works. Then it's transported, so the people who are driving the trucks or the boats or however it's being transported, that's all human labor. There's also the processing of the limestone and its crushing and all that. That's all labor. But compare that to what happens with an airplane. Well, with an airplane, there are way more steps, a lot more intricate, a lot more things happening, a lot more complicated. So an airplane, you have to start off, just like with any commodity, or with anything you're going to produce, you have to get the raw materials from the earth. That's where all raw materials come from. So you have to mine the metal, you have to tap trees for rubber, and you have to get raw materials from all kinds of other sources. You have to produce the glass, which is made out of sand, all these different things. Those raw materials are going to be all over the world, all kinds of different places. You'll find copper and metals, in areas in the middle. In Africa, you'll find, just stuff scattered all over the world. It's not just in one place. So all that has to be found, and then it has to be extracted. Then those raw materials have to be shipped all over the world. So people who are flying the airplanes, or who are steering the boats, or driving the trucks, that's all labor. Then they go to factories all over the world. All those people working in factories are producing small components, or individual components, or batches of components, which then have to get shipped to other factories that get put together into larger portions of the plane, and then they get shipped somewhere else, and ultimately all of the pieces come together to produce an actual airplane. Now, that's not even the entire process, because there's actually a lot more that goes into that process than just building the airplane physically. So you have to design it. So you have to have engineers who work on researching different designs, different ways of building airplanes, different factory processes, all kinds of different things. What's the best way to design a wing? What's the best way to design a cargo hold so it doesn't crash your plane? You have to have people managing the logistics. You have people who are selling the airplane. That all counts. And then even things that you wouldn't necessarily expect, like the education of all those involved. So the time and effort, the human labor that goes into producing the airplane also includes all the training that the engineers got. So the engineering teachers at colleges all throughout the world, that goes into that work that goes into producing engineers themselves, who then have to design the airplane. Well, all that teaching and all that effort is counted for the human labor. So you can think, or looking at this, you can see just the sheer amount of effort that goes into producing an airplane, and it's quite higher, significantly higher than the amount that goes into producing a box of chalk. And that, if we go back to that table, we can see, and I just made these numbers up. These numbers are just completely out of my head. I picked them because they're nice and easy to divide. But if Marx is correct and the labor theory of value is correct, it just takes 10 million times as much human labor to produce an airplane as it does to produce a box of chalk. Now, what does it mean to say then that as the amount of human labor that's needed to produce something goes down or goes up, that it's going to affect the exchange value? Well, let's say there's some type of invention, or some type of, if somebody goes out there and they do some research that allows us to build a plane with half the materials that we use now, and it cuts the cost of producing a plane down to $5 million. Well, for Marx, he would make the case that what happened was you just reduce the amount of labor that goes into producing the plane, and therefore it's going to reduce the cost. So think about the difference between somebody building a car by hand. The amount of time and effort they have to put into that would be massive. Not just taking doors and putting on a frame, but actually building the frame, actually getting the metal out of the ground. All of those steps, one person or group of people just doing by hand without using any machines. Well, it would take a huge amount of labor, and in order for to make that process worthwhile for the people making the car or the airplane or whatever it is, you'd have to pay them a huge amount of money. But now we have factories that take care of all that, or take care of a lot of the labor, so cars become significantly less expensive. That's why when early America, or not early America, but in the early 1900s, when people started producing cars on assembly lines, you start to see the cars become much more common because they're much more affordable, because it takes a lot less human labor. Now, there's machine labor, but machine labor is not included in exchange value, so that's not an issue for Marx or for the labor theory of value. So, just want to pose a quick question at the end, and that's getting at this question. Well, it is the question of whether or not use value and exchange value are they related to each other. And what I mean by that is, does use value determine exchange value? So, are things that are really, really useful also really, really expensive? And surprisingly, the answer is going to be no. For Marx, there's absolutely no connection between use value and exchange value. Use value is entirely determined by the physical object, what it does. Exchange value is entirely determined by the amount of labor that goes into an object. It's not supply-demand. It's the amount of labor that goes into the object. And if you want to think about it like something like air, right? Well, air isn't a commodity, unless you're buying it and selling it, which you don't really do, although there is an exception, which I'll maybe mention in a second. But its use value is extremely high. You take that away, we all die, right? Same thing with water. We have water, water's paid for, but water is so cheap that people at college campuses or in malls or in buildings, wherever, just have it in water fountains where anybody can go walk up to it and drink it, or fill their water bottle with it, or do whatever they want, or wash their hands with it, or whatever. And we don't get charged for that. But we need that to live. But something like diamonds, which have really, really high exchange value, but very little use value, they look pretty, and in certain contexts, they're parts of chainsaws, for instance. But even those are cheap. Those are cheap diamonds, crappy ones. But those have really high exchange value. So just because something's really useful or we need it to live doesn't mean it has really high exchange value. Or just because something has really high exchange value doesn't mean it has really high use value. So they are two different things for Marx anyway. So that's it. So we'll just feel free to email me any questions that you might have. Also, feel free to bring any questions with you to our next class, although I do want to jump right into Weber as soon as we get there because we don't have a ton of time in class. But anyway, so let me know, and let me know if you have any suggestions for the videos or any issues, because it's again, I'm new to this.